Imagine a room with no doors. Imagine a window, barely a slit in the stone, too narrow for a human head to pass through, letting in only a sliver of freezing Carpathian air and the grey, dying light of a winter afternoon. Inside, the air is stale, thick with the smell of unwashed linen, rotting food, and the slow, inevitable decay of a living body. There is no warmth here. There is no conversation. There is only the scratching of rats in the walls and the heavy, rasping breath of a woman who was once the most powerful figure in all of Hungary. She sits in the darkness, her skin pale and paper-thin, her hands, once adorned with the heaviest gold and the rarest rubies, now trembling, grasping at the rough hemp of a prisoner's rags. This is the Countess Elizabeth Báthory in her final days. And if you listen to the whispers of history, if you believe the legends that have been told around campfires and printed in penny dreadfuls for 400 years, you are looking at a monster. You are looking at the Blood Countess. The story is so famous it has become a part of our collective nightmare. We all know the grotesque tableau. We picture the Iron Maidens, the torture chambers hidden beneath the velvet luxury of Székely Castle. We imagine the steam rising from a copper bathtub, filled not with water, but with the crimson metallic-smelling life force of 600 young virgins. The legend tells us she was a creature of supreme vanity, a vampire in all but name, who believed that bathing in the blood of the innocent would freeze time, keeping her skin as smooth and white as alabaster, preserving her youth against the ravages of age. It is a perfect horror story. It combines vanity, cruelty, and the supernatural into a package that is impossible to look away from. But let us pause. Let us extinguish the candles and look into the shadows of that room again. What if everything you think you know is a lie? What if the red stains on her reputation were not blood but ink, spilled by enemies desperate to destroy her? Consider the unique angle that history often conveniently forgets to mention. At the height of her power, Elizabeth Báthory was not just a woman. She was a titan. She was a widow holding vast estates that dwarfed the holdings of the king himself. She controlled strategic castles, commanded private armies, and, most dangerously of all, she held the promissory notes of a monarchy that was effectively bankrupt. The King of Hungary owed her a fortune so vast it could never be repaid. The Church viewed her Protestant faith with suspicion and greed. So ask yourself, was she truly the most prolific female serial killer in human history, a demon in human shape who slaughtered peasant girls for sport? Or was she the victim of the most elaborate, brutal, and successful frame-up the world has ever seen? A coup orchestrated by the Church and the nobility to shatter a powerful woman, seize her lands, and cancel a debt that threatened to topple a kingdom. We are going to walk through the freezing halls of her castle. We are going to examine the witnesses who were tortured until they said what the judges wanted to hear. We will look at a trial where the accused was never allowed to speak, never allowed to defend herself, and was sentenced to be walled up alive in her own bedroom, immured in stone until she starved alone in the dark. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and leave a like. Not just to help the channel, but because every interaction tells YouTube that stories like this deserve to be told. Because this is not just a story about blood, it is a story about power. It is about what happens when a woman becomes too strong for the men around her to tolerate. We are about to peel back the layers of myth to find the rotting truth underneath. We will descend into the dungeon, not to find the bodies of virgins, but to find the evidence of a conspiracy so cold it chills the blood even 4 centuries later. The ending of this story is not a jump scare. It is something far worse. It is the slow, suffocating silence of a woman screaming the truth behind a wall of solid brick, while the world outside writes a legend to justify her murder. Prepare yourself. The true horror of the Blood Countess isn't what she did to others. It's what was done to her. Long before the ink of history branded her a demon, and decades before the first whisper of scandal echoed through the courts of Vienna, there was simply a girl named Elizabeth. To find her, we must travel back to the year 1560, to the marshlands of Exed, a place where the fog clings to the ground like a shroud and the sun seems to struggle against a perpetual grey twilight. Picture a cradle carved from dark oak, rocking gently in a draughty chamber of a fortress built to withstand the Ottoman cannons. Inside lies a child of the highest nobility, born into a bloodline as ancient as the mountains. Yet she is not born into safety. She is born into a world of biting cold and medieval brutality. The wind here howls through the arrow slits, carrying the scent of stagnant water and the distant metallic tang of war. As she grows, running through the labyrinthine corridors of the family estate, we do not see a predator. We see a fragile, terrified child. History often forgets that the monster began her life as a victim of her own biology. Little Elizabeth suffered from what was then known as the falling sickness, epilepsy. Imagine the terror of a 6-year-old girl playing with her wooden dolls on a rush-covered floor when suddenly the world begins to tilt. The light fractures. A high-pitched ringing screams in her ears, drowning out the voices of her nursemaids. Her muscles lock. The control over her own small body is ripped away by an invisible hand. She falls to the hard stone, thrashing in the dust, her eyes rolling back, plunging her into a terrifying darkness. When she wakes, hours later, her tongue is bitten and swollen. Her limbs ache as if she has been beaten, and she is surrounded by the pitying, fearful stares of adults who believe she has been touched by spirits. The treatments for such an affliction in the 16th century were often worse than the disease. Imagine the confusion and revulsion of a sensitive child forced to endure the superstitious cures of court physicians. They would rub the blood of a non-suffering mole onto her forehead or force her to drink concoctions of crushed skull and bitter herbs. She learned early that pain was a form of medicine and that the body was something treacherous, something that needed to be subdued. But beneath this frailty, there was a brilliant, burning mind. While other noble daughters were taught only to embroider tapestries and pray, Elizabeth was voracious. She learned to read and write, not just in Hungarian, but in Latin, Greek, and German. In a world where even great kings were often illiterate, she was an intellectual anomaly. Picture her sitting by a tall window, the light catching the dust motes dancing in the air, her small fingers tracing the lines of classical texts. She found solace in logic, in words, in the order of language, which stood in such stark contrast to the chaos of her physical health. She was a lonely soul. The sheer weight of her family name, the Báthorys, isolated her. She was royalty without a crown, surrounded by servants who were property, not friends. Her only companions were the shadows of the castle and the stern portraits of ancestors who glared down from the walls, men who were celebrated for their brutality in battle. And then childhood was stolen completely. At the tender age of 10, the concept of innocence was stripped away by the stroke of a quill on a marriage contract. She was betrothed to Ferenc Nadezhdy, a man she barely knew, a soldier destined to become one of the most feared generals in Europe. 10 years old. Think of a 10-year-old you know today. Now imagine her being packed into a carriage, the heavy wooden wheels churning through the mud, taking her away from the only home she had ever known. She was sent to the Nadezhdy stronghold to be trained in the duties of a wife. She stood in the courtyard of Sarvar Castle, a tiny figure in stiff brocade and heavy pearls, looking up at the towering walls of her new prison. She was a stranger in a strange house, surrounded by her future mother-in-law's stern courtiers. The nights were long and silent. She would lie awake in a bed that felt too big, listening to the wind rattle the shutters, clutching a rosary. praying for a sense of belonging that never came. There was no cruelty in her eyes then. There was only the profound, aching vulnerability of a girl who had been traded like cattle to secure a political alliance. She was a pawn on a chessboard played by powerful men. She was smart, yes. She was wealthy, yes. But she was utterly powerless over her own destiny. The tragedy of Elizabeth Báthory does not begin with blood spilled in a bathtub. It begins here, with a scared epileptic child, shivering in the drafty halls of a Hungarian castle, desperate for a kind word, while the world around her sharpened its knives and prepared her for a life of violence. She was not born a monster. She was crafted by a cruel century, molded by isolation and hardened by a life that never once asked her what she wanted. But to understand the descent, we must understand the fire that fueled it. It was not a fire born of hatred, at least not in the beginning. It was born of a consuming, terrifying love, a love that was forged not in sonnets or silk sheets, but in the cold, hard iron of war. When Elizabeth looked at Ferenc Nadasdy, she did not see a monster. She saw a god of war. He was the Black Beg, the scourge of the Ottoman Empire, a man who rode into battle with a savagery that made even the hardest soldiers flinch. And she, the fragile girl who had once convulsed on the floor in epileptic fits, became intoxicated by his strength. He was everything she was not, invincible, brutal, and absolutely free. Their marriage became a masterclass in violence. Picture them in the great hall of Sarvar, the firelight dancing on the trophies of his campaigns. He did not bring her flowers. He brought her stories of the battlefield. He taught her that mercy was a weakness, a crack in the armor where the enemy would slide their dagger. He showed her how to discipline the servants with a whip, how to command a garrison, how to look at a trembling human being and feel nothing but the icy calculation of a ruler. And she drank it in. She became addicted to the taste of authority. It was a forbidden desire for a woman of her time, the hunger to be the hammer, not the nail. But there was a darker current running beneath this education. Ferenc was often gone, away on campaigns for months, sometimes years. Elizabeth was left alone in the vast, echoing silence of the castle, surrounded by hundreds of servants, managing an estate that was a kingdom in itself. The loneliness was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest. To fill the void, to feel close to the husband who was carving his name into history with a sword, she began to emulate him. She began to enforce discipline with a fanaticism that bordered on worship. If a maid missed a stitch in the embroidery, if a silver cup was tarnished, it wasn't just a mistake. To Elizabeth, in her isolated, fevered mind, it was an insurrection. It was chaos, and chaos had to be crushed. This was her secret passion, the pursuit of perfection through pain. As the years ground on, another enemy began to stalk the corridors of Székely Castle, an enemy that no sword could kill: time. Imagine her sitting before her vanity, the silvered glass reflecting the flickering candlelight. She leans in close, her breath fogging the mirror. She traces the first fine lines appearing around her eyes, the slight slackening of the jawline. For a woman whose power was tethered to her beauty and her husband's lust, every grey hair was a catastrophe. Every wrinkle was a step toward oblivion. The obsession took root here. It wasn't just vanity. It was a desperate, clawing need to freeze the clock. The legends say this is when the madness truly bloomed. They say she struck a servant girl in a fit of rage, dragging a comb so hard through the girl's hair that it tore the scalp. Blood splashed onto Elizabeth's hand, and as she wiped it away, she imagined, or perhaps she truly saw, that the skin beneath the blood was paler, smoother, rejuvenated. Whether this moment happened in reality or only in the dark recesses of her psyche, the result was the same. A door had been opened that could not be closed. The connection was made. Vitality could be stolen. Life could be transferred. But the true breaking point, the moment the passion turned into an uncontrollable spiral, was the death of Ferenc. When the Black Beg died, the anchor was cut. The only man she loved, the only man she feared, the only restraint on her darkest impulses, was gone. She was a widow in a world of wolves, surrounded by powerful men who wanted her land, her money, and her submission. The grief was a howling gale inside her mind. She couldn't stop, because stopping meant admitting she was just a grieving widow. Stopping meant surrendering to the age that was creeping into her bones. Stopping meant letting go of the brutal legacy Ferenc had left her. So she tightened her grip. The discipline in the castle became a ritual. The screams from the servants' quarters became the soundtrack to her nights, a twisted lullaby that reassured her she was still powerful, still in control, still the mistress of life and death. It became a compulsion, a drug. The more her enemies circled the castle walls, plotting her downfall, the more she retreated into the dark sanctuary of her torture chamber, trying to scrub away her own mortality with the blood of others. She was possessed not by a demon, but by a terrifying refusal to fade away. She loved the power too much to let it go, even if it meant wading through a river of blood to keep it. While the Countess paced the stone floors of Chejte, lost in her grief and her grim obsessions, a different kind of darkness was gathering hundreds of miles away. This darkness did not smell of iron and blood. It smelled of beeswax, parchment, and the sickly sweet perfume of the Viennese court. It was the darkness of bureaucracy, of political maneuvering, and of men who smiled with their mouths while their eyes calculated the weight of gold in another's pocket. We must look away from the torture chamber for a moment and look at the ledger. Because in the early 17th century, the Kingdom of Hungary was bleeding. The long, grinding wars against the Ottoman Empire had drained the royal treasury dry. King Matthias II sat on a throne that was essentially mortgaged. And the holder of that mortgage, the widow Báthory, she held the promissory notes. The crown owed her a fortune so vast it is difficult to comprehend in modern terms, enough to field armies, enough to buy cities. As long as Elizabeth lived and remained free, the king was in her debt. He was a monarch in name, but financially he was her servant. And in the shadows of the royal court, the vultures began to circle. They whispered that a woman, a widow no less, should not hold such power. They whispered that the Nadasdi estates were too large, too strategic to be left in the hands of a female who refused to remarry and relinquish control. Enter the architect of her doom, György Thurzó. Thurzó was the Palatine of Hungary, the second most powerful man in the kingdom after the king himself. But more cruelly, he was Elizabeth's cousin. He was a friend of the family. He had broken bread at her table. He had fought alongside her husband. When Ferenc died, he had entrusted Thurzó with the protection of his wife and children. But protection is a fluid concept when ambition is involved. Thurzó looked at the map of Hungary and saw the vast swaths of land owned by the Báthory-Nadasdi alliance. He saw the castles that controlled the trade routes, and he saw a king desperate for a solution to his debts. The conspiracy was not hatched in a dungeon, but in warm, well-lit rooms over goblets of fine wine. The plan was elegant in its brutality. If Elizabeth could be proven to be a monster, a heretic, a murderer of noble blood, her lands could be confiscated, the debt could be erased, the king would be free, and Thurzó would be the hero who purged the land of a demon, taking a generous slice of her estates as his reward. They needed a narrative, and the rumors swirling around the countryside provided the perfect ammunition. The whispers of peasant girls disappearing, of strange cries in the night, of the Countess's erratic behavior. These were not investigated for the sake of justice, they were weaponized. Throughout the year 1610, the net began to tighten. You can almost feel the static in the air, the pressure dropping before the storm. Thurzo began to collect statements. He didn't go to the police. He sent spies. He gathered testimony from disgruntled servants, from enemies of the family, from anyone who had a grudge. The ink flowed across the parchment, constructing a portrait of depravity that would shock the world. Elizabeth, isolated in her mountain stronghold, was blind to the knife at her throat. She believed her rank protected her. She believed her name was a shield that no law could pierce. She continued her life in the freezing isolation of the Carpathians, unaware that every letter she wrote, every order she gave, was being watched. The tension in the castle grew thick. Servants exchanged nervous glances. The local priests, emboldened by the Palatine's interest, began to preach against the Jezebel in the castle. The villagers of Szejście, who had lived in fear of the castle on the hill, began to sense a shift. The predator was about to become the prey. By December 1610, the trap was set. The king gave the order. The debt would be cancelled not with gold, but with iron. Thurzo gathered his soldiers. They were not marching to war against the Turks. They were marching against a single, aging woman. Imagine the scene. It is the dead of winter. The mountains are buried in snow. The forests are silent and grey. A column of soldiers rides through the pass, their armor clinking in the cold, their breath pluming in the air. They ride under the banner of justice, but they carry the mandate of greed. As they approach the winding road to Szejście Castle, the sun begins to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the snow. Inside the castle, the fires are lit, and the Countess prepares for another evening, perhaps believing she is safe, perhaps believing she is untouchable. But the heavy wooden gates are about to burst open. The shadows she courted for so long have finally arrived, and they have brought the Palatine with them. The investigation is over. The invasion has begun. The night of December 29th, 1610, did not begin with a scream. It began with the heavy, muffled thud of boots on snow, followed by the shattering of wood. The gates of Szejście Castle, which had stood as an impenetrable barrier between the Countess and the world of common laws, were breached not by a siege engine, but by the sheer, overwhelming force of betrayal. Gheorghe Thurzo did not come to talk. He did not come to negotiate the debt. He stormed the great hall with a retinue of soldiers, their torches casting wild, dancing shadows against the tapestries. The air, usually stagnant and cold, was suddenly alive with the heat of invasion. What they found, or what they claimed to find, was a tableau straight from the depths of hell. The legend says Thurzo walked into the main chamber and stumbled upon a scene so grotesque it made his battle-hardened soldiers vomit. A young girl lay dead in the center of the room, her body drained and pale as marble. Another was still alive, her body pierced with holes, bleeding out onto the rush matting. A third was found cowering in a corner, wounded but conscious. The smell was overwhelming, the sickeningly sweet metallic scent of fresh blood mixing with the heavy perfume Elizabeth used to mask the stench of her own decaying sanity. Elizabeth was found sitting amidst this carnage. She did not run, she did not beg. She stood up, her face a mask of imperious outrage, demanding to know why her cousin had dared to enter her home without invitation. She was the Countess Nadasti. She was a Báthory. To her, the blood on the floor was a domestic issue, a matter of discipline, not a crime for the courts. But the trap snapped shut. She was placed under house arrest immediately. But for her accomplices, the servants who had held the basins, who had heated the irons, who had buried the bodies in the orchard, there was no mercy. Their trial was a farce of speed and brutality. Their fingers, the very hands that had served the Countess, were ripped from their bodies with red-hot pincers. They were thrown onto pyres, their screams echoing off the castle walls, a horrific overture to the silence that was coming for their mistress. Elizabeth, however, could not be executed. Her blood was too blue, her family too powerful. To kill a Báthory publicly would be to invite civil war. So the Palatine and the king devised a punishment far more cruel than the axe. They designed a living death. They took her to her favorite room in the castle. It was a space of luxury, filled with her velvet gowns, her jewels, and the mirrors she had stared into for so many years. And then the masons arrived. Imagine the sound: scrape, slop, scrape, the rhythmic wet sound of mortar being spread on brick. Elizabeth stood in the center of the room, watching as the workmen began to fill the doorway. She screamed at them. She offered them gold. She threatened them with the wrath of God and the king. But they did not look at her. They simply laid the bricks, row by row, rising higher and higher. First, her view of the hallway disappeared. Then the sounds of the castle were muffled. The wall grew until it reached the top of the archway. They did not leave a door. They sealed it completely. They moved to the windows next. The sweeping views of the Carpathians, the mountains she had ruled over, were blotted out by stone. The light in the room began to die. The air grew thick with dust and the smell of wet lime. Scrape, slop, scrape. Finally, there was only a small slit left, a gap in the masonry no larger than a serving platter. Just enough space to pass a bowl of scraps and a cup of water, just enough space to let in a thin, grey beam of light that would serve as her only clock. As the final brick was tapped into place, the darkness became absolute. The silence was heavy, pressing against her eardrums like deep water. She was 49 years old. She was alive. She was healthy. And she was in a tomb. For the first few days, the guards outside heard her raging. She would pound against the fresh wall until her hands bled, screaming the names of her ancestors, demanding her release. She hurled her silver plates against the stone. She howled like a wounded animal, the sound vibrating through the cold masonry. But as the weeks turned into months, the screaming stopped. The rage was replaced by a terrifying, hollow shuffling. The Blood Countess, the woman who had allegedly sought eternal youth, was now forced to age in the dark, with no mirror to see the decay. Her world had shrunk to 10 paces by 10 paces. Her food was pushed through the slit like she was a feral dog. She was surrounded by her own filth, breathing the same stale air over and over again. This was the nightmare. Not the torture chamber, but the solitude. To be a woman who commanded armies, now reduced to a voice in the wall that no one answered. To be buried while your heart still beat. For 3.5 years, she existed in this stone coffin, slowly rotting, while the world outside forgot her name, wrote her legends, and spent her fortune. The monster was not slain, she was erased. On the morning of August 21st, 1614, the shuffling inside the walls stopped. For 3 years, the guards had listened to the sounds of a living ghost. The weeping, the whispered prayers, the scratching of fingernails against stone. But on this morning, there was only a heavy, suffocating silence. A guard, perhaps driven by curiosity, or perhaps by a sliver of pity, peered through the feeding slit. In the gloom, illuminated by a single shaft of dusty light, he saw the Countess. She was lying face down on the floor, her hands cold, her body twisted in the final rigor of death. There was no demonic reclamation, no burst of hellfire, just a lonely, broken woman dying in the dark, surrounded by the filth of her own captivity. But as the masons took their hammers to the brickwork, tearing down the wall to retrieve the body of the Nadasti widow, a question spilled out into the light. It is a question that has refused to die for 400 years. Was the monster real? We must look at the evidence with modern eyes. We must remember that the testimony which condemned her was extracted under the most horrific torture imaginable. Servants had their fingers crushed and their skin burned until they nodded to whatever the inquisitors suggested. In the 17th century, a confession under torture was considered the absolute truth. Today, we know it is merely the sound of a human being saying anything to make the pain stop. Furthermore, consider the numbers. The legend speaks of 650 victims, yet no bodies were ever found in such quantities. No mass graves were unearthed in the orchards of Chejde. The figure of 650 came from a single witness, a servant girl who claimed she had seen the number written in a diary. But the diary was never found. It never appeared at the trial. It has never been seen by any historian. So we are left with a chilling what if? What if Elizabeth Báthory was innocent? What if she was simply a strict, perhaps arrogant, medieval aristocrat who was administering corporal punishment that was entirely legal and standard for her time? What if her true crime was not murder, but independence? She was a woman who refused to remarry, who refused to hand over her fortune to the men circling her estate, and who held the King of Hungary in a debt trap he could not escape. In this light, the Blood Countess is not a horror story, but a tragedy. It is the story of a political coup disguised as a witch hunt. It is the story of the first major show trial in European history, designed to destroy a woman who had dared to be as powerful as a man. The blood baths may have been nothing more than herbal remedies for her epilepsy, red-tinted water misinterpreted or intentionally lied about by spies sent to frame her. But there is a third option, perhaps the most disturbing of all. What if both stories are true? What if she was a victim of a conspiracy and a sadistic killer? What if György Thurzo didn't need to invent the horror, but simply uncovered it at the moment it was most profitable for him? What if the madness of her inbreeding and the trauma of her life created a storm that no one could control? The truth is likely buried in the grey area between the monster and the martyr. Ultimately, however, Elizabeth Báthory achieved her twisted goal. She wanted to freeze time, she wanted to live forever, and she succeeded. She did not need a bathtub of blood to become immortal. She just needed a story so terrifying that the world couldn't stop telling it. She has transcended history to become a myth. She is the grandmother of the vampire legend, the shadow in the Gothic novel, the face of vanity gone wrong. She is more alive today in our nightmares than she ever was in that bricked-up room. Her legacy forces us to look into the mirror, not to check for wrinkles, but to check for the truth. It asks us how easily we accept the narrative of the evil woman, and how quickly we forget the men who profited from her destruction. History is a story written by the victors, but sometimes the ghosts of the defeated scream loud enough to be heard across the centuries. Now, the verdict is yours. You have walked the halls, you have seen the torture, and you have seen the ledger. Do you think they were a victim or a villain? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to unravel another historical mystery where the official story might be a lie, or if you want to see how a peasant rose to become a god king, click the video on your screen right now. The archives are open, and the next story is waiting.